There is a moment early in Hyper-Zionism when something inside you tightens. The book opens with a phrase that shapes nearly everything in German public life. The phrase is Staatsräson, explained in three clear words: state-defining obligation. Once it appears, it becomes the current running through the entire narrative, a pressure that exposes the country's deepest tensions. The book asks how Staatsräson, originally tied to historical responsibility, has shifted into something more controlling. How a principle meant to confront the darkest parts of the past now sets limits on what can be said in the present. And that question cuts through every chapter with a sharp force. As you move through its pages, you feel the atmosphere that settled across Germany after October 2023. A sense of tightening, a sense of unease in public life, a sense that speaking without absolute alignment with Staatsräson has become risky. Hesitation becomes suspicious, complexity becomes unsafe, silence becomes a strategy. The contributors describe a public sphere filled with quiet pressure. Institutions react defensively long before anyone challenges them. A theater cancels an event simply because someone might object. A university distances itself from its own students, afraid of how it will look. Staatsräson becomes less of a principle and more an atmosphere, a presence that does not need to be spelled out because everyone already senses its boundaries. A force that people obey as instinctively as they avoid danger. A heavy weight runs through these pages. Remembrance was once meant to widen moral awareness, urging people to recognize injustice everywhere. But slowly, that broad vision contracted into one sanctioned direction. A lesson meant for all humanity narrowed into a single political alignment. Never again, once understood in universal terms, begins to shrink. Its moral energy stops radiating outward and instead moves in only one direction. Staatsräson fuses with the phrase, and the contraction reshapes the meaning entirely. Another striking part of the book dismantles a national story Germany often repeats about itself: a story of repentance, a story of moral renewal, a story presented as proof that the country learned from its crimes and built a new identity. The contributors unpick this narrative with deliberate care. They show the relationship at the heart of Staatsräson did not grow only from remorse. It also grew from strategic interests, global pressures, and the desire of a damaged state to regain legitimacy. This examination does not diminish real acts of reconciliation. It frees them from being used as political shields. It opens a clearer view of how the country constructed its post-war identity. What replaces the polished story is more complex, more uncomfortable, and far more revealing. Staatsräson appears in chapter after chapter as a force shaping everyday life. It influences police decisions about demonstrations. It influences who gets citizenship. It influences which artists receive funding. It influences which student groups are tolerated. It influences which protests are allowed to take place. It influences who is viewed with suspicion. The book traces how accusations of anti-Semitism have widened into sweeping filter. People are scrutinized not for their words but for their origins. Young people with Middle Eastern or North African heritage. Students who navigate multiple identities. Individuals who oppose hatred in every form, yet still find themselves judged by default. These parts of the book are difficult to take in. You watch how people begin to speak less, not because they have nothing to say, but because the environment punishes anyone who complicates the approved narrative. Yet the book does not give in to despair. It insists on a public space that breathes. It argues that remembrance should inspire wider empathy, not restrict it. It insists that confronting historical horror should cultivate courage, not fear. One of the most compelling parts of the volume examines the cultural world. Here, Staatsräson becomes an unspoken audition for belonging. Artists lose invitations without explanation. Writers are removed from programs quietly. Film festivals adjust their lineups to avoid being targeted. International partners begin stepping away, unsure whether to trust institutions that seem increasingly rigid and anxious. For those living through it, the emotional pressure is intense: confusion, embarrassment, self censorship, a constant sense of being watched, a feeling that every decision might accidentally cross an invisible line. Still, the book lifts up the people who refuse to shrink, those who speak even when the atmosphere punishes nuance, those who defend the idea that remembrance must remain open to interpretation, those who insist that the universal meaning of never again should not be reduced to a single political position, those who refuse to let Staatsräson decide the limits of empathy. What the book protects most fiercely is breathing space, the right to think, the right to question, the right to grieve for every life lost to violence, without being accused of betrayal, the right to refuse narrowing of ethical vision. By the final pages, the message is unmistakably clear. Memory cannot survive as a rigid script. It cannot serve as a badge for political approval. It cannot demand silence from those who already carry the heaviest burdens. Memory is living only when it remains flexible, honest, self-reflective. Staatsräson, the book argues, must be returned to scale. It cannot be a tool that decides who belongs. It cannot set the boundaries of human concern. It cannot dictate loyalty at the expense of justice. It cannot turn remembrance into a mechanism of control. Hyper-Zionism ends with a sense of forward motion, not despair, but a determined insistence that remembrance can be reclaimed, that Germany can face its history without shrinking its moral reach, that solidarity can extend beyond the limits imposed by fear, that a society can honor its past while still allowing space for dissent. The book's final offering is simple and forceful. Memory must breathe, and breathing requires space: space to reflect, space to question, space to speak, space to grieve, space to imagine a future shaped by moral clarity instead of anxiety. The past does not ask us to be silent, it asks us to be brave.